I'm going to talk about dispositions and character in action, as the title says. I'm going to start with a quotation which I think is representative of the way in which philosophers think about dispositions. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. So disposition terms such as cowardice, fragility, and reactivity often appear in explanations. Sometimes we explain why a man ran away by saying that he was cowardly, or we explain why something broke by saying that it was fragile. Scientific explanations of certain phenomena feature dispositional properties like instability, reactivity, and conductivity. So, as the quotation notes, we often explain why something happened by citing a disposition. So we say that something dissolved by saying that it's water-soluble, or that it broke by saying that it was fragile. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Molière's famous joke in the Imaginary Invalid, where he, which appears maybe to undermine the explanatory power of dispositions, where he ridicules these scholastic physicians who, when asked why opium puts people to sleep, the answer they give is because it has a virtus dormitiva, the power to induce sleep. And of course, the joke is that the question presupposed that opium had that power, so being told that it has the power, even if in Latin, is not very informative. But actually, the answer, if you don't presuppose that opium has that power, the answer wouldn't be totally uninformative. These are things we discover, for example, when we discover that tobacco smoke is carcinogenic. What we are discovering is that it has the power to cause cancer. So we discover something about the nature of an object or a substance when we learn about these dispositional properties. Of course, we may still want to know why it has that power, and that may be the question that Molière underlies the joke. So we do learn something when we learn about the dispositions that things have. If you compare the two propositions I've put in the handout, fragile things break because they have a disposition to break, or the glass broke because it was fragile. Well, the first one, at most you will learn what the meaning of the word fragile is. If you already knew that, you wouldn't learn anything. But with the second one, you might learn something, that the glass is such that maybe even a small blow or knock would break it. It has that disposition to break. So dispositions can have some explanatory power. When it comes to human actions, as you saw in the quotation I read at the beginning, we also sometimes use terms, concepts which are dispositional to explain actions, especially intentional actions. We have other ways of explaining actions, scientific explanations that neurophysiologists and so on give us, but these psychological explanations are of particular interest to us, explanations that cite psychological terms that are dispositional. So I've given you 4 very ordinary examples in the handout that I've given you. The first one says, Alison went to the police because she discovered or believed that her car had been stolen, and she wanted to get a certificate for the insurance company. B, Tom sits at the back of the classroom because he is shy. C, I exercise in order to keep fit. And D, James shouted because he was angry. They all explain by reference to some psychological concept. The first, we might say, explains by reference to reasons, which I'm going to say are beliefs, things that people believe and desire. The second, B, explains by reference to a character trait, shyness. The third explains by reference to a goal, to keep fit, something that you aim at in your action. And the last one by reference to an emotion, anger. And although they are very different explanations, they explain in different ways, many philosophers think that they have something in common, which is that they are all explanations that rely on dispositional concepts. So many philosophers think that wanting and believing something are psychological dispositions, mental states of the person who has the wants and the beliefs that dispose you to act in certain ways. So if you want to get a certificate for the insurance because your car has been stolen and you believe such and such, then you are disposed to do certain things, like go to the police. That's one way of understanding that explanation. Shyness, you know, if you are shy, then you are disposed to behave in the way in which shy people behave. That's a character trait that is dispositional. Our aims also can be thought of as dispositions. If you want to keep fit, then you're disposed to act in certain ways, to do the things that will result in your, that you believe will result in your being fit. And if you're angry, you're disposed to act in angry ways. So these are ways in which we might say these are all psychological concepts that are dispositional. I'm not saying that that view of all of these concepts is right, but I'm just saying this is a very common way in which philosophers think about these psychological explanations. They think of them as analogous to dispositional explanations. Now, I'm in general interested in understanding how psychological concepts relate to actions and therefore how they explain actions. And that means all sorts of psychological concepts. I've thought quite a bit about reasons, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but today I want to think about character traits, which are thought of as dispositions that are psychological. And so I'm going to focus on that. I'm not going to, some of the things I say maybe will be true of other psychological dispositions, such as that, but I want to focus on that. And my aim is to understand whether thinking of them as dispositions and thinking of how dispositions generally explain the phenomena that are manifestations of the disposition, such as breaking and fragility and so on, whether that model of explanation is helpful when we think about the relationship between character traits and the actions that are their manifestations. I'm not going to settle that question today. I'm just going to raise some points, partly because we don't have time, and partly because this, for me, is work in progress. I'm thinking about these issues. So, okay, so I'm going to start now with looking at how we think about dispositions generally. I'm often going, just to distinguish, because I'm thinking of dispositions, the dispositions that philosophers often use when they think about what dispositions are, and I'm going to call those paradigmatic dispositions or ordinary dispositions, just to distinguish them with psychological dispositions, and in particular the character trait dispositions that I'm going to be talking about. So, as I say, now I'm going to try to give you a picture of how philosophers think about dispositions, what some of the distinctive features are, and then we'll think about character traits. So there's been a lot of work on dispositions in the past couple of decades, in philosophy perhaps even more, but it's really intensified recently, and many people think that they're really central to understand all sorts of things. When I talk about dispositions, I also mean powers, capacities, and so on. There may be important differences, but many people who work in this area think that they are not, and I don't have time to really discuss that issue, but we can think of dispositions as a kind of power, if you want. And so I've selected 4 features of ordinary paradigmatic dispositions that many people think are distinctive and sort of defining of dispositions. The first 2 that I've noted in the handout come actually from a list of 5 features that someone called George Molnar, who did a lot of work on dispositions, gives. He says these 5 features, of which I'm going to discuss 2 today, are defining of what a disposition is. Okay. So the first one of those features that he focuses on is directedness. He calls directedness this aspect of dispositions, that a disposition is a disposition to do or to undergo something. So perhaps the same ideas is sometimes expressed by saying that a disposition is defined by its manifestation, what it is a disposition to do. So fragility is defined as the disposition to break. Solubility is defined as a disposition to dissolve. I'm sure there are other examples that are not so simple, but at least you can get the idea. So that's directedness. What about what he calls independence? This is quite important. I'm going to focus on this today quite a lot. Independence is the idea that dispositions are ontologically, or metaphysically, or in themselves, independent of their manifestations. I mean, the point is that it's not just that we know about them because that they are, as it were, epistemically independent of their manifestations. The point is that they are ontologically independent. It's not just about what we know about them, but what they are like. So according to Molnar, independence is captured by the idea that a disposition can exist in an object or in a substance even when it's not being manifested, has never been manifested, and will never be manifested. Now, this may seem absolutely uncontroversial. Think maybe if you are lucky enough to possess a Ming Dynasty vase, which has never broken and we hope will never break. Still, the vase is very fragile. We know that maybe a small knock will break it. It has a disposition, but perhaps it will never manifest the disposition, and I'm sure owners hope that it never will. So it's a familiar notion. There are many things that, as it were, can do certain things, like explode, poison, and so on, but never do that. Often, thank goodness. Okay, so that's independence. The disposition exists independently of its manifestation, not just when it's not being manifested, but even if it's never manifested. Okay, now the last two notions I want to introduce that help us to understand the idea of a disposition. One is the concept of the stimulus condition, sometimes also called the trigger of the disposition. So I said there are things that have dispositions that are never manifested, but you might say sometimes the reason why they are not manifested is that they are not in the stimulus conditions that trigger the manifestation. So if you have something that is soluble, the trigger conditions for it might be to place it in the liquid where it would dissolve. For as long as it's not in that liquid, it doesn't have the stimulus conditions. Or the stimulus conditions for fragility is often hitting something or dropping it and so on. So there are these conditions, which may be events, or that's a very complicated notion, such that when they occur, normally the disposition is manifested. That's the idea of the stimulus condition. Now, I should note that, because you might think, oh, that's why there is independence. If a thing is not in the stimulus condition, then it's not manifested, but the disposition is still present. But actually, philosophers have noted that sometimes, or perhaps argued, depending on your view, that sometimes a thing that has a disposition may encounter, if you want, the stimulus conditions, and still the disposition doesn't manifest. So here is an example that is often used. You have, again, your very fragile vase, and you drop it. But it doesn't break, and it doesn't break because it's very well wrapped in bubble wrap. You've been very careful, you've wrapped it very carefully. So the vase is still fragile, the stimulus conditions occur, but the disposition is not manifested because it's masked. It's, as it were, there is something that is preventing the manifestation of the disposition. Maybe also you ingest something that is poisonous, and yet you don't get poisoned because you've ingested an antidote that prevents the manifestation of the poison. So that's the sense in which a disposition can be masked. There are other ways, very clever examples that philosophers have come up to show that substance with a disposition may be in the stimulus conditions and not manifest the disposition, which is called finked dispositions. I'm not going to go into them because they are complex examples, but it's just another way to emphasize that stimulus conditions are often, perhaps always necessary for the manifestation of the disposition, but they may not be sufficient. But that's because the disposition, we can say, we can identify some way in which a disposition is masked or feignt, is being prevented from manifesting. Okay, and finally, although I will say very little about this, I would have wanted to say more about this because I think this is a very interesting topic, and more when we talk about psychological dispositions. I want to introduce the final concept, which is the idea of a categorical or causal base of a disposition. This is the idea that when something, an object or a substance, has a disposition, that's because there is some non-dispositional property that it has, what is called a categorical or causal base, which, if you want, is responsible for the thing having the disposition. So to go back to Moliere's joke, you might say what the doctors were being asked is not whether opium has the virtus dormitiva, the power to put people to sleep, but what the categorical base of that is. And of course, they didn't know that. They didn't know what the chemical compounds that, which constitute opium are that give opium that power. We now know, not me, but other people know more about this, and they know something about, I don't, what is it, morphine. I did look it up, but I've forgotten. Morphine and codeine are some of the chemical elements that explain, if you want to underlie, are the categorical base of the disposition of opium to put people to sleep and do other things. There is a lot of very interesting issues that raise in connection to these topics, which we don't have time to look at today. For example, whether everything that has a disposition has a categorical base. Sometimes when you think about the categorical base, you realize that you use dispositional terms. So again, you will be looking for the categorical base for that. Morphine has the power to do such and such. So then eventually you get to the very simple components of things that, and for example, a question is, are those dispositional or non-dispositional? Another question is whether everything must have a categorical base, and so on. Okay, so there are many, many questions relating to these aspects of dispositions. But I now want to turn to psychological dispositions. So we are moving on to the third part of the talk, which is where we think about what these character traits, which are psychological dispositions, we've said, what they are like. And I want to, so think of the statement that we roughly saw in the first quotation that says, Jim ran away because he's a coward. Now, when you think about it, you see that the statement explains what Jim did by doing two things. It gives you his motive for running away on that occasion. It says he was motivated by cowardice. He sensed danger and ran away when he should have stayed. So that's his motive. But it also tells you that Jim has a disposition to be motivated in that way. He's someone who often in the face of danger reacts in that way. So this is a motive that he, if you want, is often, or it's typical of him to behave in this way. So we are explaining the way in which he acted on that occasion, both by giving a motive and also saying that the motive is one that he's disposed to be motivated by, that he's often coward, he's a cowardly person. So what kinds of dispositions are these psychological character traits like cowardice and so on? Gilbert Ryle, who many of you I'm sure know, and was a very brilliant philosopher and wrote this book called The Concept of Mind. And there he discusses quite a lot the importance of these dispositional terms for understanding human behavior. One thing he says about psychological dispositions, character traits in particular, is that they are what he calls multi-track dispositions. So he draws a distinction, which I've noted in the handout, between two types of dispositions. He says, look, on the one hand, we have single-track dispositions. These are like fragility, where the manifestation is always the same, breaking or shattering or something, but roughly the same. And then he says there are multi-track dispositions. These are dispositions that can be manifest in a variety of ways. So he thinks elasticity, for example, can be manifested in contracting or expanding, or perhaps in other ways. I don't know whether he's right about elasticity, but I think he's right about the following, that character traits are multi-track dispositions. And he illustrates the point but with this quotation that is about Jane Austen that I will read out. He says, when Jane Austen wished to show the specific kind of pride which characterized the heroine of Pride and Prejudice, she had to represent her actions, words, thoughts, and feelings in 1,000 different situations. There isn't one standard type of action or reaction such that Jane Austen could say, my heroine's kind of pride was just the tendency to do this whenever a situation of that sort arose. So there isn't just one manifestation of pride. It's very varied, and it's very varied in an interesting way because it's varied in the range of actions that manifest pride, but pride is also manifested in thoughts, emotions, desires, and so on. And this is important to, if you think that our characters are manifested not just in our behavior, in our actions and omissions, if you want, but also in our thoughts, our desires, our emotions, our feelings, and so on. Okay, so that's the sense in which you can say, you know, being cowardly is not just about running away, it's also about feeling fear, having certain thoughts, and so on. So the manifestation of a psychological disposition, like a character trait, is quite complex. And now I turn to some of the features that I think are distinctive of character traits, some of which I will claim set them apart from other dispositions, what I call paradigmatic dispositions like fragility and so on. So the first the first feature of the character traits that I want to highlight I've called dependence. It's the opposite of independence. Okay, and the idea is this, that character traits are what I call manifestation-dependent dispositions. They are dispositions whose existence requires the manifestation of the disposition. So they violate independence. They are attributed to people on the basis of the manifestation, how the person behaves, thinks, and so on, in such a way that if the person doesn't ever manifest the behavior, thoughts, and so on that are typical of the character trait, we will say they don't have the character trait. Someone who's never been generous, who's never, as it were, acted generously or thought generously, just is not generous. And I'm saying that this dependence is not just an epistemic point. It's not that we only know whether someone is generous if we see them acting generously. That may be true. But I'm saying that in the absence of the manifestation of the character trait, then the character trait is not present. Now, I'm hoping to illustrate this point with a quotation from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, just because I was reading it and I thought this was quite funny. I'm not sure how well it illustrates the point. And I can't do the American accent. I was actually not reading, I was listening to it, and someone who could really do the American accent, and it was brilliant. Not just an American accent, but the right one. So I will read it with my Spanish-English accent, and you try to imagine this Mississippi accent. So here is Huck Finn talking about his father. I don't know if you're familiar with the story about his father. He's a real villain, you know, very sort of morally dodgy character. So Huck says, Pap always said, take a chicken when you get a chance, because if you don't want him yourself, you can easily find somebody that does, and a good deed ain't ever forgot. I never see Pap when he didn't want the chicken himself, but that's what he used to say anyway. Now, Huck is apparently here allowing that for all he knows, his father may be a generous person. Maybe the father sometimes gave the chicken to someone else. Maybe it's not true that he never didn't want the chicken for himself. But in fact, we as readers know that's not true, and we know that Huck knows it. We know that his father has never manifested that generosity or kindness of giving, not wanting the chicken and giving it to someone else. And this is, as it were, an instance of dependence. There has never been a manifestation of generosity. He's not a generous man. Now you may be thinking, oh, I don't think this is true. Surely it's possible to have character traits that are not manifested, that, sometimes there may be people who are malicious or greedy or deceitful, but they don't manifest it, perhaps because they are quite good at concealing it, or perhaps they are prevented from manifesting it. And if that's right, then it seems that dependence is false. You can have the character trait without manifesting it. Well, I'm going to try to persuade you that this is not right, that dependence is right. Well, first of all, think about what it means to say that someone is concealing their character trait. One way in which this could be true is that, and this often happens in films, that the person is concealing their actions. So perhaps they are, as it were, greedily eating and drinking too much, but they don't do it in front of anybody else. Of course, that wouldn't be a very good objection, because it's clear that the character trait is being manifested in their actions, just not in front of others. But maybe they don't, say someone we are saying is greedy doesn't act in that greedy way, doesn't eat too much or drink excessively or whatever the behavioral characteristic of greediness is. But then for it to be true that they are greedy, it has to be true that, for example, they want to do it, they have the right kinds of thoughts and inclinations and emotions, but perhaps they are prevented from doing it, or perhaps they disguise it because they are embarrassed and so on. I will say more about complications there, but my point is that if they neither do the greedy actions, nor feel the desire, nor the sort of excitement at the thought of food, etc., then we cannot say they are greedy. It's not true that they are greedy. So it may be that sometimes the manifestation of the character is, as it were, internal, but that still is a way in which the trait is manifested. And this is, of course, even more obviously true if what's happening is that they are being prevented by other people from behaving in the way in which they would behave. So someone may be very cowardly, would run away, but they can't because they're locked or whatever. They can't run away. Or they would eat all the cake, but they can't because it's been taken away. So that's even a clearer way where we might say, well, the manifestation is being masked, but there may be all these internal ways in which the character trait is manifested. Okay, so just to remind you, dependence is not the idea that you don't have the character trait when you're not manifesting it. It's that you don't have it if you've never manifested it, either in action or in thoughts, and so on. Now, here's another reason why you might think that dependence is false. You might think, well, surely sometimes we discover that we have a character trait. So suppose that I find myself in a very dangerous situation and react with great courage. I risk my life in order to save others from great danger. And I do this even though it's not my duty. I'm just one more ordinary person there, one more passenger on the plane, or one more kidnapped person on the plane. This happens sometimes, often in films and in dreams. Happens to my husband in dreams a lot. He wakes up and says, I saved the world. But it actually happens in reality to some people that they say, I was very surprised, I was very courageous. I didn't know I was so courageous. And you might say, here surely they are discovering that they had the disposition and it had never been manifested. Well, I'm skeptical that that's the right way to think about it for the following reasons. First, I mean, one way in which I don't want to argue is one might say, well, look, if you've just been courageous once, doesn't mean that you're a courageous person. It just means that you did something courageous, but it doesn't give you the character trait. I think that's right. I mean, to say that someone has a character trait is not just to say that they once did it. You know, we wouldn't say that Huckleberry Finn's father was generous if he once gave the chicken. It's something, they did a good action, but that doesn't mean they have the disposition, the character trait. Still, you might say, well, sometimes there are some actions that are so courageous or so generous that you have to say this is a generous person. You have to attribute the character trait to the person. And that may be right. I think it may be that doing it once may be enough to say that to, as it were, confer the character trait on the person. But it is still possible to agree with that and to deny that what's happened here is that they had the character trait and it's just been manifested. It may be that what's happened is that that action is what's made them courageous, that, as it were, the situation made them see the point of courage, and now they're a courageous person. Of course, if they never again do courageous actions or think courageously and so on, then we'll have to say that was just a one-off. But if they, from now on, become much more courageous, we might say that's when they became courageous. That's when they acquired the disposition. Maybe that can be, maybe more plausibly so in cases of corruption. If an act is very treacherous, maybe that's actually what gives you the disposition to be, from now on, corrupt. In reality, I think that the most plausible explanation of this kind of case that I've described is that, as I say, either they are one-off, or if they are genuinely character trait, what we are discovering is that we were more courageous than we thought, or more cowardly than we thought. We already had the disposition to some degree, and now we know that it's really better or worse than we thought. So I think those kinds of cases don't undermine dependence. Okay, so this is as I say, this is dependence, the idea that unlike paradigmatic dispositions, character traits are dependent, ontologically dependent on their manifestations. Now I'm going to turn to talk about another feature of dispositions, some features of character traits which will bear on the nature of stimulus conditions. You remember the idea of the trigger of the disposition for its manifestation. I'm going to say a few things about how that works for character traits to show that there is a very interesting distinction here again. So I just said that it is possible to display the behavior, desires, and so on, which are typical of a disposition, and that's necessary, but is not sufficient for having the disposition, for which so one can, as it were, do something generous or courageous or deceitful once without being such a person. This is something that Gilbert Ryle, although I think he said lots of very right things about dispositions and character traits in particular, he seems to deny this in the concept of mind. And he says, famously, at least among philosophers, he says, I mean, famously among philosophers, not he says it among philosophers. So it is famous that he said that the statement, a man boasted from vanity, should be construed as he boasted, and his doing so satisfies the law-like proposition that whenever he finds a chance of securing the admiration and envy of others, he does whatever he thinks will produce the admiration and envy of others. This is Gilbert Ryle. And this has been criticized by many people on the grounds that it seems to imply that it's not possible to act out of a motive such as vanity or greed or whatever only once. And that, as we saw, seems clearly false. You may not be a vain person but have a moment of vanity. Maybe a very, at least it's clearly so with vices, perhaps also with virtues. So a person can act out of vanity without thereby being a vain person. And you might say that's got to be true because it's, as it were, on the grounds that you act vainly or react vainly that you have the disposition. But never mind, it's at least possible to do it. And Ryle seems to rule that out. Okay, so we have on the one hand the idea that the manifestation is necessary for possessing the character trait, and on the other, the idea that to act in a way that is typical of the character trait is not enough to have the character trait. So you can do it once and still you don't have the character trait. So what is required in order to have the character trait? How often do you have to react or act and react in the appropriate way to have this character trait? When do you have the disposition? Well, I think at least in the case of character traits, these psychological dispositions, the answer is complex. On the one hand, because having a character trait, and this is true perhaps of many other paradigmatic dispositions, so not just psychological dispositions, can be a matter of degree. You may be very generous or a little generous, quite vain, terribly kind, or whatever. The disposition may be very strong or weak or middling. And perhaps this is partly a matter of the frequency of the manifestation in the case of character traits, how often you manifest the disposition. There may be other criteria by which we decide how strongly disposed you are, how strong your character trait is. And that's one reason why we can't give an answer of how many times you have to do it. But also remember that it's not just about how you act, but also your emotional reactions, thoughts, and so on. So you have to have the range of manifestation, not just, as it were, the odd action or even many actions. You have to have the manifestation of what counts as the disposition, which includes the what I call the inner manifestations. And this brings out another aspect of the sort of dispositions that character traits are, which is that if you have a disposition if you have a character trait of a particular kind, then certain behaviors will be easier for you than either if you don't have it or than if you, than the opposite. So, sorry, let me say that again. So, one thing that is distinctive about character traits is that they make it easier for you to behave in certain ways. What do I mean by easier? I mean that it will require less effort of will, I'm going to say, to do certain things, to behave in certain ways. That's partly because all the range of psychological features that are part of the disposition, the manifestation of the disposition, like the desires, the emotions, and so on, will also be present. So it's not, you don't have to go against them, as it were. So if, for example, one has a character trait that we call a vice, then it's easier to act in a certain way than not to act in that way. So if someone is malicious, they have that character trait, then the whole is not just, as it were, their actions, but the whole psychological being is geared in that way, and it takes quite an effort not to be malicious. They have to really try hard. And for virtues, you could say something similar, but not, it's always easier to behave badly. So with virtues or with character traits, they needn't be virtues that maybe we regard as more positive. What happens is that it's easier to do the thing that is typical of the character trait than if you didn't have the virtue. So those people who do have the virtue or the positive character trait find it easier, and those who don't, don't. This is not, I suppose, very controversial, but what it introduces is this idea that whether a character trait is manifested or not, whether it's positive or negative, is something that is often, at least partly, up to the agent. And this is a crucial issue in understanding psychological dispositions, at least character traits. And I'm going to let me see how I'm doing for time. Yeah, I'm going to finish by talking about two ways in which the agent can have, as it were, it can be partly up to the agent, the issue of character traits. One is in the possession, whether the acquisition or the possession of the character trait, and the other is in the manifestation when one has the character trait. So start with possessing, having a character trait. Now, it's possible to have a tendency or an inclination to have a character trait, but still not have the character trait. So you may have the inclination to behave in the relevant ways and to have the thoughts that are characteristic of that character trait, but still not have the character trait, not behave in that way, and so on. And whether you have it or not will depend on whether it is the agent herself that determines whether the character trait is manifested in action. So let me give you an example. Suppose that someone finds that they have the desires, feelings, and inclinations that cowardly people have, but they resist, and instead of running away, they stay, and they sort of discard the thoughts that are cowardly, they fight them off, they come back, but they keep sort of trying to dismiss them and so on. If someone does that, then we might say, well, they have an inclination to cowardice, but they don't have the character trait of cowardice if they don't behave cowardly and continue doing those things. So what they have is, if you want, an inclination or a disposition to have the disposition that is a character trait, but they needn't have the disposition. So I'm suggesting that, and this is perhaps why it is possible for people to be born with tendencies and temperaments that incline one to certain character traits, but there is room for maneuver there. There is possibility for the agent to have an influence in how those second-order dispositions to have the character trait, become real character traits or not. So that's one sense in which the agent, we can say the disposition is partly up to the agent. Of course, many things may have to be in place. You might have to be quite fortunate to have good upbringing and so on. I think I don't dare to say anything about Aristotle because there is a great Aristotelian expert present here, but Aristotle certainly had a lot to say about how upbringing affected, as it were, the possibility of becoming a virtuous person. But what I'm emphasizing is that one might have dispositions to have character traits, positive or negative, and still you need to do something, or you may do something to prevent those from becoming your character traits. What about acting motivated? Let's suppose you do have already the character trait. Say, I said, just as you can have, we already said, you can act jealously once, even though you are not a jealous person. You might say, I don't know what got over me. I suddenly had this very jealous reaction, but I'm not a jealous person. If you are not self-deceived, that's possible, as we saw. So we can act out of character. So because the sort of flip side of that is that you can have a character trait and not act according to it, not manifest it. And you might say, well, that's what you told us about dispositions in general. You said that you may have the dispositions, the stimulus condition may be present, and yet they're not manifested. So this is not very different in the case of psychological dispositions like character traits, because all I'm saying is that you may have the character trait, you may find yourself in the stimulus condition, but it's not manifested. So you may have the character trait, let's say, of being quite dishonest, to choose a nasty one, and you are you have the opportunity perhaps to cheat someone and so on, but you don't do it. So what's the difference between that when it's a psychological disposition like a character trait and when it is an ordinary paradigmatic disposition? Well, that the dispositions in the case of the character trait may not be masked or feigned in any way. It's not that anything is preventing you from manifesting the disposition is that you yourself determine whether the disposition is manifested. Of course, sometimes this may take a huge effort of will, but it is in principle possible. It is in principle sometimes at least partly up to the agent whether these character traits, these dispositions are manifested. Not only that, but it's also possible through repeated check of the manifestations, whether it's in behavior or in thought and so on, to diminish the strength of the character trait, perhaps even to get rid of it altogether, perhaps to acquire the opposite character trait. So if, like me, you're very untidy, I keep trying. I don't think I've reached tidiness, but maybe I'm less untidy. And you can, so it's something over which we can, if you want, is partly up to us. And that's why when we think about character traits as dispositions, often instead of thinking of the stimulus conditions, the thing that triggers the behavior, the manifestation, as really stimulus conditions, we think of them as opportunities, because they are, as it were, possibilities for us to do or not to do, to manifest or not to manifest the character trait. Is partly up to the agent. And that's a fundamental distinction between psychological dispositions and non-psychological paradigmatic dispositions, that there is this possibility of choosing whether to manifest the disposition, I mean, choosing how to act, determining whether the disposition is manifested. So I will just finish by saying that it is true that we explain human actions and the behavior of inanimate things by reference to their dispositions. And I have said that although that's true, at least some psychological dispositions are distinctive. They are not, you know, they have features that set them apart from paradigmatic dispositions. I've only talked about character traits. I haven't talked about any of the others, but I think the others also have their own peculiarities. I've said that one of these features is that they violate this notion of independence, because the character trait is dependent on the manifestation. And also have said that there is this idea of stimulus condition, that when we think about it in relation to character traits, we should think of it in terms more of opportunity, because the manifestation of the character trait is up to the agent. Now, it is, of course, a very hotly contested issue, which is at the heart of the controversy about the compatibility between freedom or the voluntary and so on, and the possibility of determinism, whether this idea of being up to the agent and choice and so on can really play the role that I'm saying it plays in psychological dispositions and their manifestation, and if so, how it plays it. We already a couple of weeks ago, someone talked a little bit about this, you know, how free we are. And I'm not, as we were, claiming to have shown that choice is possible. I'm only saying that prima facie, at least, there is this very distinctive feature of character traits, which is that their manifestation is at least sometimes partly up to the agent. And that's it. Thank you.